do a quick video about the eye in the orbit. So we will start first with the bones of the orbit. Then we will talk about the eyelid. So the bones of the eye to the eyelid and all the structures that are inside. Then we will talk about the blood supply and then the muscles that are attached to the eyelid, along with some glands. And then finally the nerve compartments or innervation. So that should be our overview about the eye. So let's jump right into it. We have 7 bones of the orbit. We have the frontal, maxillary, zygomatic, sphenoid, ethmoid, lacrimal, and palatine bone. All of these bones contribute to the eye skeletal in some way. So we have the eye, which is everything like the eyeball, the muscles, and the neurovascular bundle, and all of the space that is not the eyeball and the muscles is called the orbital fat. The orbit is made up into an pyramidal shape, where the apex or the cone is at the optic canal and the base is at the orbital margin. So that's what you're showing here, is that we have the outer surface, we call that the base, and that is at the orbital margin, whereas the apex going into it is at the optic canal. Next we have is the 2 walls. We have the medial and the lateral wall. So the medial walls are parallel to each other, whereas lateral walls are 90 degree. And this is a picture showing you here. In the you have 2 medial walls that are parallel to one another, and then you have lateral walls that are at a 90 degree angle, or will form the 90 degree angle. And so if we subtract the angles, we can figure out that there's about a 23 degree orbit axis, and there is a parallel visual axis. So what that means is, as you can see, the red line is my visual axis, so that is parallel, and the blue line is will be my orbital axis. Carrying on, we have the roof. We have 3 basically directions to the orbit. We have the roof above, we have the medial wall, and then we have the floor. So we know above the orbit will be the frontal sinus, medial to the orbit will have the ethmoidal cell or ethmoidal sinus, and then floor of the orbit will be the maxillary sinus. And the maxillary sinus is important because of the blowout fractures. It's also the thinnest part, so due to the intra-orbital pressure, as the eye cannot expand, it will cause the fracture in the maxillary sinus. Next, we can talk about all the bones that make up the orbit. So once again, there are 7 bones of the orbit: frontal, maxillary, zygomatic, sphenoid, ethmoid, lacrimal, and palatine bone. First, as we can see on the left right here, we have the orbital margin indicated in different lines. So the yellow line on the top is the superior margin, made up of the frontal or the maxillary bone, the frontal bone. So specifically, we have the orbital plate of the frontal bone, and then the yellow, you can see the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone as a superior wall. Then we have a medial wall, which is the sphenoid bone, ethmoid bone, lacrimal bone, and the ethmoidal frontal bone. Then we have the inferior wall, which is your zygomatic, your orbital surface of the maxilla, and the palatine orbital process. And then the lateral wall is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone and the frontal process of the zygomatic. So here we can see the greater wing of the sphenoid bone and frontal process of the zygomatic bone. So that is all the bones of the eye and the orbital margin. If we carry on, next we will talk about eyelid and the lacrimal apparatus. But just before that, I wanted to focus on, we have, as you can see here, maybe in red will be better, we have 3 holes that are really important in the eye. We have the optic canal, we have a superior orbital fissure, and then we should have an inferior orbital fissure on the bottom. So I will just draw that on the side or up above. So if we had optic canal, a superior orbital fissure, and an inferior orbital fissure, so you can see it's like some type of a phase, and then it's important to know what comes in through. So the optic canal can have the cranial nerve number 2, we have the optic nerve, we have the ophthalmic arteries. Then we have the superior orbital fissure that will get all cranial nerves from 3, 4, V1, and 6, as well as the superior ophthalmic vein. And then the inferior orbital fissure, this one right here. This was my superior, this is my optic. Inferior will have your V2, the maxillary branch, and the inferior ophthalmic vein. Okay, now let's talk about the eye itself. So here we will start from superficial to deep structures. The first structure that we have is the orbital septum, and the orbital septum is just a weak membranous sheet that is continuous with the periosteum, the bone above the skull, and it kind of drapes over our tarsal rim. So what is a tarsal plate? We have two. We have the superior inferior tarsal plates, and that is what gives the eyelid its shape. And usually example of that is when the third you have young boys that flip out the eyelids, and they're doing that to the superior inferior tarsal plates. Inside the tarsal plate we also have tarsal glands that secrete the oily substance. So when you get the water in your eyes retain the water and not let it out. And that is due to the tarsal glands. Attached to the superior tarsal plate is a muscle the superior tarsal smooth muscle, along with the levator palpebrae superioris. Both of these contribute to opening the eyelid, whereas the facial expression muscle orbicularis oculi is responsible for closing the eyelid. So going back to opening the eyelid, we have a muscle, levator palpebrae superioris, which is innervated by cranial nerve number 3, and that just does normal opening of the eye, whereas we have a smooth muscle, and smooth muscles are innervated by the sympathetics, also by cranial nerve 3, but they have a different innervation, and that causes sympathetic response, such as opening the eye super wide. With the help of levator palpebrae superioris. Another side note is that superior tarsal the loss of eye or vision or drooping of the eyelid can be due to loss of sympathetics, and we call that the Horner syndrome. So there you have few symptoms like miosis, ptosis, and anhidrosis, everything related to the eye, drooping of the eye, and the eyelid. Going down, then we have the blood, basically the vasculars to the eyelid. We have the arteries and the veins. Up top here, arteries, we know they kind of join each other. We have 3 arteries in the eye: ophthalmic, the facial, and the superficial temporal. Ophthalmic comes off the internal carotid through the optic canal. The facial and superficial temporal are both off the external carotid. There are about 6 branches from the ophthalmic artery. We have the central retinal artery, which is the only blood source to the retina, with the ethmoidal, nasal, lacrimal, supraorbital, and supratrochlear arteries. Veins are in the eye, just like in the face, are valveless. So we have the superior inferior ophthalmic veins that will drain into the cavernous sinus, and the angular veins from the facial vein can also drain into the cavernous sinus. And this is important as infections can lead to cranial infections, as the facial and the eyelid arteries and veins are connected to the cranial cavity. Next, we have to talk about the gland. So we have the lacrimal gland, which is very superior and lateral to the eyelid, and it will drain into the nose. So it travels from the lateral side of the eye towards the medial and down into the nose. And then we have conjunctiva, which is just the layers of the eyelid. So we have a inner layer, which is palpebral, and we have an outer, which covers the lens, as the bulbar. In between those, you have a U-turn, basically, and that is called the conjunctival fornix. It's a U-turn where both palpebral outer is continuous with the bulbar, and that is the location of basically contact lenses. So when you put a contact lens in, that's where it will sit. So going to the side, or let's carry on, and then I'll draw a quick image to show all of this. So we have the eyeball, which comprises of three coats. We have the external, the middle, and the internal inner. The external is a fibrous made up of the sclera and the cornea. Sclera is the white, and the cornea is a transparent section. Then we have the middle vascular, made up of the choroid, which is located between the sclera and the retina. Ciliary bodies is what will change the shape of the lens, and then is also innervated by the parasympathetics. And the iris gives the eye color as well as the diameter of the pupil. And the last inner layer is the retina, or the rod cones. If we keep going, we have two compartments that we can split the lens or the eye into. Here we have the lens right here. Anything in front of that, we will call it the anterior compartment of the lens. Anything behind it will be the posterior compartment of the lens. In the anterior, it can be subdivided. We have the anterior chamber, which is located between the cornea and the iris. So all of this is the anterior chamber. Posterior chamber is between the iris and the lens. And then that is where we also have the aqueous humor that is produced in this posterior chamber of the anterior compartment. In the posterior compartment, everything we have is the vitreous humor that holds the lens or the eyeball in place. So here we have our eyeball. Here we have our, draw this a little bigger. Here's our tarsal plates, some eyelashes attached. Inside the tarsal plate we have, so this is my tarsal plate. We have this gland, the tarsal gland, and the tarsal gland is responsible for giving the oily substance that is responsible for like waterproof the eye. We also have muscles attached into the tarsal plate, so you can have two muscles. You can have the superior tarsal muscle that provides sympathetic innervation, and then you can have the levator palpebrae superioris that will open the eye in a normal fashion. And the bottom we can have or top and bottom, both we should have our orbicularis oculi to close the eyelid. Next, if we talk about the lacrimal gland right here, we said the lacrimal gland is where the tears are produced, more superior lateral position of the eye. It moves through the conjunctival fornix or across the eyelid, across the eye itself, into the lacrimal canoniculi, and then into a sac via the nasolacrimal duct. We'll get into the nasal cavity. So if we draw that, so basically you can have an eye, you can have a gland up top, we'll go into a sac, go into a duct, into the nose. Oh my god, this is horrible nose, but it'll work. So if we have our superior meatus, middle meatus, and then the inferior meatus in the nose, and so we have our, right here, the lacrimal gland. Oops. We have our lacrimal gland right here. It will then lead to the get inside by the conjunctival fornix. go across the eye into the lacrimal canaliculi, into the lacrimal sac, through the nasolacrimal duct, and we'll get into the inferior meatus of the nasal cavity, which is right under the inferior nasal concha. So let's keep going as we're talking about the eyelid and lacrimal apparatus. We just talked about our superior and tarsal plates right here. We can see the tarsal plate with its gland, and then we have the muscles that provide some type of sympathetic innervation. So we know in sympathetic things your eyes will dilate. Next we go into the eyeball itself. Eyeball is made up of three coats. We have the fibrous external, we have a vascular internal, vascular meaning a lot of blood vessels, and then internal we just retina. In the external we have two things. We have the sclera and the cornea right here, sclera, cornea, and then in middle we have the choroid, ciliary body, and the iris. So we will draw that right here. So you can see up top we have the external right here, which comprises of the sclera, which is the outermost layer of the eye. Then we have this orange cornea, which is transparent anterior part. Then in the middle we have the choroid, so this is a choroid body. We have the ciliary body and the iris. So this is my iris here. And then this is my choroid. And then this is my ciliary body. And let's going back to the purpose of our external fibrous layer. We have the sclera, which is the white part out here. We have the cornea, which is the transparent part. And then more importantly, in the middle vascular, we have the iris that gives it the color. But the iris has two muscles. We have the sphincter that will close it, and we have a dilator that will open it. And those are both could be, so dilator will be my sympathetics, and sphincter would be my parasympathetics that take part in the iris. Then we have the ciliary body. Ciliary body changes the shape, of lens. And this also provides a parasympathetic mechanism. If we talk about the compartments of the eye, here we have the interior compartment, and then we have the posterior compartment. We can, if I erase the cornea and the sclera up top, I'll just do that. So anything in front of my lens in blue is my interior compartment. Everything back here is my posterior compartment. The only thing in the posterior compartment, like I said here, is the vitreous humor. And everything in the anterior can be split into an anterior chamber here and a posterior chamber here in relationship to the iris. So everything in front of the iris and the cornea is anterior chamber, and then everything behind the iris is posterior chamber, and you have the aqueous chamber, which is produced by the ciliary body. So here, aqueous humor, which is secreted by ciliary body, moves from posterior to anterior. And if you have a buildup of that fluid, that causes glaucoma or vision loss. So here we can see we have the ciliary body, and then the aqueous humor in blue here is produced, and it will go from posterior through the pupil outside to the anterior chamber of the anterior compartment. Once again, here's a picture. You can see we have the outer fibrous in blue here, the sclera and the cornea. And then we have our iris and the ciliary body with the choroid, that is the middle vascular, and then just the vitreous body and the retina in the back. So if we have to differentiate, this is our external, This is the middle vascular, and this is the inner. We have two humors. We have the aqueous humor, which can be here in blue next to the lens, and then we have the vitreous humor, which is everything in the posterior compartment. And this is my anterior compartment, split into the anterior chamber and then the posterior chamber. If we keep going, we finally have to talk about the muscles of the eye. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 muscles of the eye. We have the mnemonic LR6, SO4-3, that gives you the innervation. So LR, the lateral rectus, is innervated by the 6th cranial nerve. SO4, the superior oblique, is innervated by the 4th, and everything else is innervated by the 3rd. If we talk about the function, the lateral rectus, it moves things laterally, so that means it is doing abduction, moving things away from the midline, innervated by 6, which is abducen. That's how the name comes. So lateral rectus moves lateral, meaning abduction, innervated by abducen. Superior oblique moves things in torsion. Basically, it's innervated by trochlear, so it does abduction and depression. Then we have inferior oblique that does extorsion, elevates, and abduction. Superior rectus does elevation, inferior rectus does depression, and then opposite of lateral rectus, which did abduction, we have medial rectus that only does adduction. Once again, with the help of levator palpebrae superioris and the ciliary muscle, we're able to elevate the eyelids. Finally, talking about the innervation, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. So during sympathetics, our eyelids will dilate, but they dilate by contracting on the dilator muscle. So you contract the dilator muscle, your eyelids will dilate, along with the help of the superior tarsal smooth muscle. Superior tarsal muscle. Dilator pupillae is the smooth muscle here that's innervated. This is the only thing that's innervated by sympathetics. And we know the chain of the sympathetic starts from the IMLCC, goes to the superior cervical ganglion, hitchhikes on the internal carotid, rides on the short ciliary nerves, and innervates the pupillary dilate muscle to cause dilation of the eyelids. On the other hand, we have our constrictors. So parasympathetic, to constrict the eyelid, you will still contract the constrictors, the pupillary sphincter muscle, smooth muscle, with the help of the ciliary muscle. And the order of the innervation is, for parasympathetic, nuclear cephediner Westphal, which is the cell bodies for CN3, will ride on oculomotor nerve, synapse on ciliary ganglion, once again short ciliary nerves to the muscles. Finally, if we talk about all the nerves that are associated with the eyes, here we start with CN2. So cranial nerve 2 optic has afferent fibers in the retinal ganglion cells. They are myelinated, which provide us afferent vision from the eyes to the brain, afferent information. Oculomotor is mostly efferent, provides innervation to all those muscles except lateral rectus and superior oblique. CN4 is everything else is efferent, so we have efferent trochlear for superior oblique, we have efferent abducen for the abduction lateral rectus, we have the trigeminal, which provides us with V1 branch, the frontal nerve, that can be split into superior or supraorbital and supratrochlear. We also have the lacrimal nerve that provides parasympathetic to the lacrimal gland, and the nasociliary, which provides us to the dorsum of the nose and ethmoidal cells in the middle. Finally, infraorbital nerve also runs close to the orbit, and it comes out of the infraorbital foramen. It's a V2 branch of the trigeminal, will provide us with innervation to the maxillary molars through the posterior superior alveolar nerve. After that, it will go in the hole inside the orbit and give innervation to the interior maxillary incisors via the anterior and middle superior alveolar nerve. So if we have a nerve going here, we have a hole you will get the posterior superior alveolar that will exit before going in the hole, and then inside the hole we have our middle and the anterior. And in relation to the teeth here, this will be my incisors, this can be my premolars, for example, and this could be the molars.